Greetings, I'm Jackson Snyder. I'm doing this little video to ask you to consider coming with us, the Vero Essene Yahad, for Sukkot this year, 2018. We'll be Sukkoting in Chattanooga, Tennessee, at the Booker T. Washington State Park there. And we're going by the Essene calendar, that is the Enochian solar calendar. So our Sukkot is from October 2nd through the 10th, 2018. And I'd ask you to consider that. The details of our Sukkot are found here. www.theyahad.net. That's THEYAHAD. theyahad.net. Yes, well, it is the Sukkot. We got a great lineup of speakers and a great lineup for fun. This is an in-gathering. This is the time we all get together with our Facebook friends from the Vero Yahad, the think tank, etc., and enjoy each other's company, teaching, fellowship, and really good food. I hope to see you there.
It's like 9:40 here, so it's pretty early.
Oh, wow. So as other times I've done these teachings, on occasion I cut out because of the internet. If that happens, I typically get back in within a few minutes, so just be patient if that happens. This is continuing the series of Jubilees that we've been doing for a while, and I'm trying to go through and point out the interesting aspects of the Book of Jubilees from the perspective of it being an authority, because I read Jubilees as an authoritative text on similar level as Genesis. Many people in the Hebrew roots and just people who follow the Bible, they don't have that level of authority they ascribe to Jubilees, but I think that's a mistake. I think Jubilees is a very important text, and for the Yahad, we're trying to study the Jubilees we're focusing on the Dead Sea Scrolls a lot and believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls forms a ancient link to the original faith of the apostles. So studying texts like Jubilees helps give us insight into what the faith of the apostles was, and trying to emulate that and learning potential lessons from it. So that's why we're doing this series. Last time we focused primarily on genealogy differences. There were a few other things I wanted to say about that. Last time I went into a lot of detail. This time I'm not going to go into too much detail on those things, but I'm going to just point out a few interesting things that we can glean from the genealogy information that Jubilees reveals to us. So, like I mentioned in the last teaching, in the Samaritan version, it's unique in that the patriarchs from Shem all the way to Noah, it actually gives the total years. Like it says how many years they were when they had their son, how many years after they lived, and then how many years in total they were when they died.
Is that original in there, or is that an addition?
I believe it's original, but it's only in the Samaritan copies. It's not in the Masoretic or the Septuagint. So the reason I think it's original is because it's the same. You see the same thing in Genesis chapter 5 in all three versions. You see it in the Masoretic, Septuagint, and Samaritan. So like what you were just talking about with the whole consistency thing, it would make sense that the original was more consistent in the same genealogy framework of Genesis 5. That same framework is in Genesis 11. So it would make sense that it would be the same setup and it is the same setup in the Samaritan. To me, it makes more sense for scribe. I believe in a principle for scribal textual criticism that it seems a lot of the scholars don't agree with this idea, but I think it makes sense to me. And that's basically the principle of laziness, where scribes had a huge motivation to be lazy because they had to copy everything out by hand. So, and I know from my own work, I start out being very detailed, very extreme in information in the beginning, but then as I continue writing out the document, I start getting tired and I start cutting corners because it's a bit of a drag to do all those details a million times. The first 1,000 times I could do the excessive detail, but after a while it gets repetitive. So sometimes it's easy to cut corners. And I think that's what happened a lot of times with the scribes in the various witnesses we have of the different books of scripture. We do see evidence of laziness where texts like the Septuagint and other, like Samaritan and the Dead Sea Scrolls, they contain repetitive information that would make sense for people to be like, okay, we don't want to write this a billion times. We'll take the repetition out because we don't need the repetition. Because as I said the other time, if you take 4 plus 7, you know that equals 11. So you could write it out for someone, 4 plus 7 equals 11, or you could just say 4 plus 7, and you know that the reader probably has a basic understanding of math and can do the total themselves. So anyways, all that to say, the importance of the Samaritan Torah I spoke of last session, and it appears that the Samaritan preserves the original totals because all the numbers for Genesis chapter 5 for the Samaritan agree exactly with Jubilees numbers. So, and it also gives the totals. So the totals for the Samaritan of Genesis chapter 5 we can trust. That makes me believe that we can also trust the totals of the Samaritan version for Genesis chapter 11. Now, Genesis chapter 11 is more complicated than Genesis chapter 5 because with chapter 5, the Samaritan agrees with Jubilees every time. But with chapter 11, Jubilees disagrees with all three witnesses of Genesis. It completely, hold on, let me see. Mute conversation. Someone's doing this thing, like this weird group post that keeps sending me a message, so I just gotta
Yeah, I got one too. I just bugged out of it.
yeah,
I don't know any of those people.
it was like 120 people that they sent it to. That's crazy. Anyways, so what's a peculiar thing that we spoke on last time is in the 3 different versions of Genesis chapter 5, the numbers differ, but they all seem to try to be adding up to the same total most of the time. That same phenomenon occurs in Genesis chapter 11 between the 3 witnesses. They all try to add up to the same, roughly. So that suggests that these totals are not random, but these totals are probably close to the original, and it's the exact numbers that are adding up to it, the total, which are in question. So that can help. The totals, I think, are very important for trying to figure out what the full lifespan of these individuals are. Now, a interesting thing of the totals, the totals for the chapter 11, the Samaritan and Masoretic always agree in the totals. The Septuagint, however, usually differs for some reason. The totals differ. So for our FactSet, for example, the total is 438 for the Samaritan and Masoretic, but the Septuagint has a total of 565. And then we talked about how Canaan, there's an extra generation in the Septuagint and in Jubilees, that's Canaan. Septuagint gives the total as 460. Then for Selah, the total is 433 years for the Masoretic and Samaritan, and 460 for the Septuagint. Aber, the total is 404 for the Hebrew witness, and the Septuagint is 464. So that's a difference of 60. So obviously there must have been some scribal mistake there, because you know how we have 404, 464. That's very similar. That can't be coincidence. That must be either a scribal error, accidental, misreading a number. Peleg, it's 239 for the Hebrew. The Greek is 339. So now, for the rest of these figures, for the next three figures, the Septuagint has 100 years more in the total than the Masoretic and Samaritan. Normally, like in chapter 5, it wasn't 100 years extra in the total. It was 100 years extra in how old they were when they had their son. But that doesn't happen all the time. Okay, that happens also with chapter 11, but in addition, it also has an extra 100 for the total for the Septuagint. So based on that, it definitely seems like the Septuagint is not correct, because it's adding an extra hundreds that should not be there. So as I said, Peleg was 239 in the Hebrew, 339 in the Greek. Reu, 239 and 339. Serug, 230 and 330. So you see that 100 extra in the total. Nahor, 148 in the Hebrew, and in the Greek, Septuagint, 304. So it's very wildly different in the Septuagint for Nahor. Terah is let's see here. Terah is 145 for the Samaritan, 205 for the Masoretic, and 275 for the Greek. So Terah differs widely as well. So with all those differences, how do we make sense of which one's the original? Well, as I said, I think Jubilees is very reliable in much of its information, and I think we can use Jubilees to weed out which one is correct and which one's not. So some interesting things when we look at this information. Septuagint has Shem dying before any of his descendants die. So you would expect from a family lineage the father to die before the son. That's typically how it happens in nature. So that's a positive for the Septuagint. It has a plausible father dying before their son in every case for the Septuagint. The Masoretic is highly improbable. The Masoretic has Shem dying after all his descendants die, even Abraham. So in the Masoretic, Shem keeps living until he sees all his descendants die up to the time of Abraham. Even Abraham dies. And then after Abraham dies, then Shem dies. That is very unlikely. And that's what the Masoretic rabbinic tradition, though, bases their ideas on Abraham meeting Shem and saying that Shem was Melchizedek, for example. That's only based on that highly unlikely Masoretic chronology. How that happens, well, so in chapter 11, Samaritan and Septuagint typically have the same number of years for how old the person was when they had their son. in the Masoretic, it's usually 100 years less than what the Septuagint and Samaritan say together. And then Jubilees, as I said, doesn't agree with either of the three in how old they were when they had the son. So Jubilees is like in a middle form, and I think it makes more sense for, like, I don't see why Jubilees would take, like, Jubilees agrees with the Samaritan, as I said in Genesis chapter 5, for every date. It wouldn't make sense for the Jubilees author to then look at Genesis chapter 11 and say, I don't like any of those dates. I'm just going to make up my own dates and just make up random dates. That doesn't make sense. It makes more sense that Jubilees was based on a very different version of Genesis, or that Jubilees and Genesis are both derived from, like, as I said, Genesis Apocryphon. But that the Genesis that was original was very different than the Genesis we have today, and that it's been altered over time, and that the original Genesis was closer to Jubilees. So, let's see here. So that, to me, I think it's more plausible. We have strong evidence that the scribes altered Genesis for polemical reasons. The reason we know that is because it can't be accidental changes, because the numbers add up. In most of the versions, the numbers are adding up to the same totals. It's just the different numbers adding up to it are changing. So that can't be accidental. It has to be intentional changes. And why would they intentionally change the numbers? They change the numbers intentionally because they're trying to force it to fit their particular opinion about something, either their perspective about history, how it all fits together. They definitely have an agenda that they're trying to fit. Jubilees doesn't seem to be having that same agenda. It seems that Jubilees is completely independent in that the scribes are not trying to alter Jubilees to force it to fit a particular theory. So that's what goes in Jubilees' favor, is there isn't evidence of foul play with the numbers in Jubilees in the same way there is in the Genesis numbers. So I think we can trust Jubilees' numbers more for that reason. But as I said, I do think we can trust the totals. So I think we can take the totals of the Samaritan, and we can take the year each man was when they had their son in Jubilees, and we can take that and combine it with the Samaritan totals and reconstruct the original numbers for chapter 11. I believe that we can do that confidently. Now, in the Samaritan, Shem dies after his son Arphaxad dies. So basically, Shem dies just dies before all his descendants die, with the exception of his son. So that's more real. That's also realistic. That's not implausible. Some fathers die before. Some fathers have their sons die before they die. That has happened. That's not implausible. And Jubilees, Jubilees does not say how long they lived until after they. Jubilees. All right, Jackson, you said among the three stooges, Shemp died second after Curly. Yes, that is very. Thank you for interrupting us with that important information in the comment section. So with Jubilees, how long each person lives after they have a son is not specified. But if my theory is correct, that the totals are reliable, then we can have an idea of how long each person lived after they had a son. And if we take that, then what we have is here's what we have in the four witnesses for Abraham, for example. Abraham was born In the Septuagint, Abraham was born after Serug and everyone before died. Serug is Abraham's grandfather, I believe. Yes. No, wait, great-grandfather. The Samaritan has Abraham born after Reu or Serug. It's right around that time. Abraham is born after them and everyone before it died. That's in the Samaritan. In the Masoretic, as I said, that one's all wacky. Masoretic has every single one of Abraham's ancestors still alive when Abraham was born. Again, not very plausible. Jubilees has Abraham born only when so the people who are born when the people who are alive when Abraham is born is Abraham's father, Terah, his grandfather, Nahor, his great-grandfather, Serug, which is plausible to be alive when your great-grandfather is still alive. And then Aber. Aber is a few generations back, and the reason I think Aber might have been alive when Abraham was, that's only possible with Jubilees chronology for Aber to still be alive, and Masoretic. The reason I think Aber might have been alive is because the whole definition of Hebrew is strongly linked with Aber. And you have in Genesis, for example, it says the sons of Shem were children of Aber. Why is it connecting it with Aber? I think it's because Aber might have still been alive when Abraham was alive. And it says that in Jubilees, it says that Abraham was given the scriptures of the fathers. It doesn't say who gave them to him, but it says he had the books of his fathers. So it would make sense if Aber was the one who gave Abraham the scriptures, it would make sense for Abraham to consider himself, Aber and his descendants to be considered the Hebrews, and for the Hebrew language, like the name for that to originate. So that's my theory. I don't know if that's true or not, but Jubilees suggests that Aber was still alive, and that Peleg, so Aber was alive when Abraham was. Hold on, let me see. Okay, the question is, have I calculated the difference in total years the Septuagint adds to the genealogies compared to Jubilees, Samaritan, and Masoretic? I haven't written down, but I mean, there's a website, on, like, for example, Wikipedia points it out, and for example, it has the birth of Abraham, like for the Masoretic, 1948, the Samaritan, 2,249 years after creation is when Abraham was born. Septuagint, 3,414 years after creation was when Abraham was born. So Septuagint differs wildly. Jubilees has Abraham born 1,881 years, so it's closer to actually Masoretic. It's actually fewer years than the Masoretic. The reason why it's fewer is because, so like I said last time, the differences for the flood, Jubilees agrees with the Samaritan that the flood happened about 1,300 years after creation. Masoretic has 1,600 years after when the flood happened. And Septuagint has 2,250 years when the flood happened. So Jubilees agrees with that 1,300, that small number. But then Septuagint and Samaritan, they both add 100 years for each of the people after the flood. The Masoretic has 100 less than the Samaritan. So for the Samaritan, for the people from Shem all the way to Abraham, it's about 900 years, 950 years, that span. The Masoretic has that span as like as only a little less than 300 years, because it subtracts 100 from each person. So if you would subtract 100 from like 10 people, that you can see why it's so much less time in the Masoretic. So you have the 1600 plus about 300. That's where you get the 1950 in the Masoretic, when Abraham was born. Jubilees takes the smaller number for chapter 5 of the Samaritan of Genesis, the 1300 number, and then it takes a bigger number than the Masoretic for the people from Shem to Abraham. It has a number closer to 600 years between the flood and Abraham's birth. So when you take that in, it has Jubilees dating Abraham's birth to around 1880. So hopefully that answers the question. And the Septuagint keeps prolonging the information in like in the other books too, where, like, for example, if you look at Josephus, you see some alterations as well. Josephus keeps adding extra years in the manuscripts of Josephus. So when you get to when the Messiah supposedly came, when he did come, supposedly the Septuagint says, when you add up the dates in the Septuagint, the Messiah came 5,500 years after creation. The Masoretic and the Jubilees have it very close to around 3,800 years after creation. Samaritan has it more like let's see, Samaritan would have it at about 4,200 years after creation. So I would say the Septuagint is, like I mentioned the last time, I suspect that the reason they altered the Septuagint was because they were trying to reconcile it with history, like the history of Egypt and the history of the Greeks. That would be a strong motivation to change it, because the people who accept the scriptures, they don't want people to reject the scriptures. They want people to think it's historically accurate. So they would have motivation to be like, okay, the scriptures in our current copies are contradicting history, so we gotta fix the scriptures. And it would make sense if they're trying to fix the scriptures. It would make sense that they're not altering it to random dates, like completely random dates out of nowhere. It would make sense if they like altered it by hundreds. Like, oh, maybe if we alter it by 100 here and there. They're trying. The scribes tried to alter as little as possible, because they didn't want to completely change the message. They sometimes wanted to tinker with the message, but they didn't want to completely make an entirely contrary message to the original. They tried to tinker it, usually. There are exceptions where the scribes radically changed what the meaning is, but most of the time, their purpose was not to change completely what it was saying, but was to simplify it or to slightly correct it based on their particular belief of the passage. So it would make sense if they thought the history was an error in the scriptures and that they were trying to fix it to make it agree with history, that they would make slight changes like 100 here, 100 there, altering it like that. There's not the same reason for motivation to subtract 100 years. If you're trying to, it wouldn't make sense to say, oh yeah, the scriptures are in line with history. Let's remove 100 years so that it's no longer accurate with history. You see, that to me is a good motivation for the scribes. Hey, Navio, can you mute your... Thank you. So I think that's a good motivation to explain why the Septuagint has so much more years added, because they were trying to reconcile it with history, but trying to change as little as possible without altering the actual numbers. They were trying to change it by hundreds. If you change it by 100, you're altering it only slightly. So that's my perspective on the numbers there. And so if you take Jubilees numbers with the totals of the Samaritan, with the exception of Aber and Peleg, everyone dies before their son dies, like in the Septuagint. So you know how I said that's a plus. The Septuagint, the Septuagint has a plus, a positive aspect of it, in that each son dies after their father dies, which is how you naturally would expect it. That's the same thing in Jubilees, with the exception of only two people, Aber and Peleg. So I think Jubilees and Septuagint have a plausible father-son transmission. So now another thing in basically we have some other details in the scriptures that can help us realize that the Septuagint and Samaritan are in error for the chapter 11 for how old they were when they had a son. And the error is as follows. It says, Abraham said, shall a man who is 100 have a son? And in the Septuagint and Samaritan, all the way up until Abraham, people who are more than 100 are having a son, which does not make sense with Abraham's statement. With the Masoretic, it does make sense, and with Jubilees, it does make sense. Because in Jubilees and Masoretic, in chapter 11 of Genesis for Masoretic, and in the Jubilees throughout, everyone after Shem has a son a good amount less than 100 years old. Typically, in Jubilee, it's around the 60s. Let's see. So in Jubilees, do I have it here? Yeah. So let me just say for the Masoretic, the numbers for Masoretic are, for how old they were when they had the son, are 35, then 30, 34, 30, 32, 30, 29, 70. It's a big jump. And of course, Abraham was 100 when he had Isaac. Jubilees, however, has these numbers. It has 65, 57, 71 or 70, right around there, 64, 60, 59, 57, 63, 70. So that's more consistent. It's all right around 60, 70-ish, which is right where Terah was when he had their son, his son. But with the Masoretic, it's all low numbers, like 30s. Even one of them was 29. That's really low. But then it jumps up to 70, and then it jumps up to 100 for Abraham. If it's all around 60 and 70, that's more consistent. So let's see. That's pretty much. Let me see. Is there anything else? Yeah, that's pretty much it for the numbers of the genealogies. But now I'm going to discuss the age of Abraham in Jubilees, or when Abraham was born in Jubilees. There's a problem in Jubilees. There are corruptions. Sometimes there are passages in Jubilees where the numbers are in error. But the reason we know they're in error is because the overall context and flow has the correct numbers. So like if you have like a number line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like you're counting all the way up. If someone says I'm going to count to 100 and they start counting to 100, and then when they get to 53 they accidentally say 57, and then they go back to 55, you know that 57 is the one that's wrong. 57 is the one that's wrong. It should be 54 because the pattern in the surrounding context is keep adding 1 every time because you're counting to 100. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 100. So if you're at 53, followed by 57, followed by 55, then you know the 57 is in error, and that must be 54. That's how Jubilees works. Jubilees has most of the dates accurate. A few of the dates are incorrect, but the surrounding context helps you know, okay, that was a mistake there. With Abraham's life, some of the numbers are inaccurate in our copies of manuscripts of Jubilees. And I believe the reason for that is because Genesis says that, so for example, for Noah, it says, Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's what Genesis says. So wait a minute. Noah was 500 years old, and he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So does that mean they were triplets? Well, no. According to Jubilees, they were born 2 years apart from each other, each of them. So Shem was born, and Ham or Japheth 2 years later, and then the other one 2 years after that. But Genesis just simply abbreviates it and says Noah was 500 years and had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. According to Jubilees, Noah was 500 years old when he had Shem, and then 2 years after had the one, and 2 years after had the other. So Genesis is abbreviating and simply simplifying and saying he was 500 when he started having kids, and the kids he had were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The same thing is happening in Genesis for the sons of Terah, and that would be, it says, Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So it's not clear how old was Terah when he had Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Jubilees doesn't actually tell us how old he was when he had Nahor and Haran. It only tells us how old he was when he had Abram. The problem is how old he was when he had Abram according to Terah. When he had Abraham according to Jubilees, that conflicts with the other dates of Jubilees. So from my perspective, because Genesis is not clear, I believe that it makes sense that the scribes were looking at Jubilees. They knew that Genesis said Terah was 70 years old when he had Abraham, Nahor, and Haran, and they assumed that meant that Terah was 70 years old when he had Abram. So they altered the text of Jubilees to make it say that Terah was 70 years old when he had Abram. And because that changed, that threw all the numbers into error. So then the scribes were like, oh no, what's going on? The numbers are not adding up in Jubilees. They're inconsistent. So in some places, the scribes changed it to reflect Abraham being born when Terah was 70. However, there's a good amount of evidence that Abraham was actually born when Terah was 75 years old, not 70 years old. And one of the things supporting that, for example, is, how it says in the letter of, I think it's Galatians, it says the covenant with Moses was made 430 years after the covenant with Abraham. That number, 430, when you take that number and you take what Jubilee says when when the covenant was given, that was in the year 2411. When you subtract 430, that brings you to 1981. Okay, 1981. That's when Isaac was born, because that's when the covenant was made. And Abraham was 100 years old, so 1981 subtract 100, that would be Abraham being born 1881. And some of the passages of Jubilees actually say that Abraham was born in 1881 after creation. So I believe that is the correct, that Abraham was born when Terah was 75 and not 70. And I think that's where the numbers got messed up in Jubilees. So that's my theory on trying to make sense of the conflicting numbers in Jubilees about when Abraham was born.
Do you mean 2081, not 1881?
No, because in Jubilees, it actually has a little bit earlier. It actually has well,
you said 2411 minus 430 is 1881. Abraham would have been 100. So then if he was born 100 years earlier, it would be 2081 and not.
Wait, so 2411 minus 400 is 2011, minus 30 is 1981. That's when Abraham was 100 years old. And then you subtract 100 to get when Abraham was born, and that's 1881.
No, you go the other way.
You want to
If he was 100 years old at 1981, we're going backwards because this is BC, not AD.
No. We're using a different. We're not using BC. We're using it's like AC. It's called. It's basically.
Got it. Okay.
It's counting up from the year of creation according to what the Bible claims the year of creation is, or at least the year when Adam was formed.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the confusion. Sorry about that. So 2,411 years after creation was when Jubilee says the covenant was made with Moses. Galatians says it was 430 years prior when the covenant with Abraham was made. Subtract 430 from 2411, you get 1981. And subtract 100 to get when Abraham was born, you get 1881, and that agrees with some passages of Jubilees for Abraham. Because as I said, the passages in Jubilees contradict each other for Abraham's information. And I think the reason for that is the scribes got confused with what Genesis says about how Terah was 70 years old when he had Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. So hopefully that clarifies. Now, the next little stuff, I think what I'm going to be able to do is, like, I have an outline here of some of the information, and I think I'm going to end with the information of like the names of Abraham's family, because that's a very interesting stuff. So I'm going to go into the names now. This is very interesting things that Jubilees reveals to us. So, so first of all, it says that, you know Ur of the Chaldees. In Hebrew, it's Kesed or Kesedim. It says that Canaan, Canaan is Shem's grandson. Okay, so Canaan's brother was Kesed. Then Canaan had a son named Shelah, and let's see. Let me just see. I'm looking at Jubilees. Okay, Shelah married a woman named Muak, and Muak was the daughter of Kesed. Okay, so there's the connection right there. Then we have Aber. And I'm sorry about the noise in the background, the dogs, but so Aber took a wife, and the wife's name was Azarad, and Azarad is the daughter of Nimrod. Jubilees actually says Aber, the Aber of the righteous line, married Nimrod's own daughter. So that's a very interesting connection, and that basically is Jubilees saying that all the Jews, all the Israelites have Nimrod's blood in them. That's a very interesting information, because some people believe Nimrod's blood was corrupted by like Nephilim. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think that's the case. So Jubilees tells us that Nimrod's descendants intermarried very early on. So that means all the Hebrews, because Hebrews are descended from Aber, so all Hebrews have the blood of Nimrod because Aber married Nimrod's daughter. So
All right, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Is this the same Aber that was married to Yael?
Who would Yael be?
Yael was the lady who pounded a stake through the head of. Who is that?
No, that's a different one. That's like
a different one.
Yeah,
okay.
I think that's Jabber, or something. I haven't looked at that in a while, but that's in the book of Judges.
No, he says they came into Eber's tent.
Oh, really?
Eber was gone. Yes, and I'm trying to think of who that was. The head of the Assyrians.
Okay, but yeah, that's from a later time.
She gave him milk, and he fell asleep, and she did away with her. So that was later on?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know that in the Bible, they always repeat names all throughout.
Yeah.
So it's a later person there. Peleg, who did Peleg marry? Peleg's wife was Lamna, the daughter of Shinar. And what is Shinar? Well, we know that there was a place called Shinar it says in Genesis chapter 10, again, connecting with Nimrod, it says Nimrod began his kingdom. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. So Jubilee says that Peleg married the daughter of Shinar. So it's just like there's a land of the Kesedim, and that ultimately comes from an actual man named Kesed. So also the land of Shinar is linked with an actual man named Shinar. Same thing with the Canaanites, come from an actual man named Canaan, and that's where the land was called Canaan. So now we look at Reu, and Reu's wife is a woman named Ura, and Ura is the daughter of and is a son of Kesed. So hold on. Hello. This is my mom. Okay, so of the Chaldees, of Kesedim, that is originating, according to Jubilees, the son of Kesed, and Reu married Ur's daughter. Now we have Serug. Let's see. Serug. Okay, Serug married Milcah, daughter of Keber, and Keber was Reu's brother. So I believe that means Serug was marrying his cousin. Okay. Now this is going to be cool. I'm gonna reveal some interesting stuff in a second, but I just want to read these other things here. Nahor married a woman named, according to Jubilees, it's Ijaska. That sounds random, right? Who's Ijaska? I'm going to reveal who Ijaska was in a minute. It says Ijaska, though, was the daughter of Nestag of the Chaldees. So that's, again, connected with the Kesed. What's interesting is that the Book of Giants actually has a name similar to Nestag. It has Naxtag, and another name, Taxtag. So that's a possible connection there. So Nestag is the woman's name. And, no, I'm sorry, is the man's name. Nestag is the man's name, the father of Iasca, or Iasaka. Now, Terah, here's where it starts getting really cool. This is Genesis gives us information about people's names, but it doesn't explain why it's telling us these things. It's like, okay, who cares? I don't care about that information. But with Jubilees, everything starts making sense. It's like, oh, that's why Genesis says that. Oh, okay. So Terah married a woman named Edna, and Edna was the daughter of a man named Abram. Okay, and Jubilees tells us, why was Abram named Abram? He was named Abram because of his grandfather's name, Abram. So Abraham was named after his grandfather, his mom's dad. And his mom's dad, it says in Jubilees, the reason was because his mom's dad died before she had a son. So when she had a son, they decided to name him Abram after the honor of her dad that had died. So that's a cool little detail that we don't get in Genesis, but that we do get in Jubilees. Now, what supports Jubilees' take on this is that it suggests that Abraham's entire family, like, you know how families have like naming traditions? Well, according to Jubilees, Abraham's family liked to name their children after their ancestors. It's kind of really cool. So I'm going to point out these cool things. It says that in Genesis, it tells us that who Haran's daughters were. Okay, so Haran's daughters were, it says, Haran was the father of Milcah and Iscah. So Haran was one of the sons of Terah. Haran had 2 daughters, as well as his son Lot, but his 2 daughters were Milcah and Iscah. And what did we see here? We saw that let's see here. Okay, so basically, I'll tell you what all this means. That means Abraham was named after his mom's dad. Okay, Nahor. Abraham had a brother named Nahor, and remember, Terah's dad was named Nahor. So Nahor was named after his dad's dad. Abraham's dad's dad. So Abraham was married after his mom's dad, and Nahor was married after his dad's dad. Now Milcah, which is Haran's daughter, Milcah, is named after her paternal 2 times great-grandmother. So Nahor's mom, so Terah, remember Terah's father was Nahor. Nahor's mom was named Milcah, because remember I said earlier, I said Serug married Milcah, the daughter of Keber. So that means Serug had a son named Nahor, and Nahor's mother was Milcah, because Milcah married Serug. And so Haran's daughter Milcah is being named after his great grandmother. No, his great grandmother and his daughter's great grandmother. So, and then the same thing for Iscah. Iscah was Haran's other daughter, and that's Terah's mom. So Abraham's dad, Terah, his mom was named, remember I said Ijasca? That's linked to the Hebrew Iscah. So Jubilees kind of garbles the name Ijasca. But when you connect it with Genesis, we know the original Hebrew is Iscah and not Ijasca. So that's a very cool link that we're seeing here. All the family of Abraham is being named after ancestors. And then Jackson, did I when you say editing, Are you talking about editing in the recording, or what are you?
I'm just saying that what you're presenting here is so deep and complicated. I mean, I'm just going to edit it some in order to
for like
clearer.
a
Make it
okay,
a little clearer. That's all.
All right.
I just wanted to let you know.
Okay, before you do that, can you send me the unedited version?
Sure.
All right, that'd be great. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify with that. All right, and we don't know. For example, we don't know why Haran was named Haran. We don't have information on that. We don't know why Sarai was named Sarai. Sarai was one of the daughters of Terah from another wife, according to Genesis. We don't know who Terah's other wife was. His second wife, we don't know. We don't know who Lot was named after. But based on the principle that we see in Jubilees, it's very plausible that Haran was named after a family relative, maybe an uncle or something like that. Sarai was probably also named after one of her aunts or something, or one of her grandmothers. Like maybe Sarai was named after, since Sarai came from a different wife of Terah, just like Abraham was named after his mom's dad, it's possible that Sarai was named after her mom's mom. But we don't know for certain. That's just speculation. But that whole principle of naming their kids after family relatives, that would be very plausible. And for Lot, it could be after Terah's brother or Terah's uncle. We don't know exactly. But there is however, an interesting thing where after Haran dies, they move to the land of Haran. It most likely did not have that name. It probably only came to have that name because Abraham and Terah decided to name that land after Haran that died. So that land, when it says in Genesis and Jubilees that they moved to Haran, most likely it didn't have that name originally, and they just named it after Haran in honor of him. And then there's also a place, according to Jubilees, there's a place called Boa Lot, and it's possible that was named after Lot. Maybe Boa Lot, the place Boa Lot, was named after Lot or something. We don't know exactly. But we do see this principle in Jubilees connected with Genesis, where places are named after people, or people are named after places. We see this connection. So Canaan, in the land of Canaan. Haran, land of Haran. All these different things we see. Kesedim, of the Chaldees. Is the son of Kesed. He built a city, and that's of the Kesedim. Shinar, I mentioned, was from a man that was actually named Shinar. So we've got all these clues in Jubilees connecting us that these were actual people. These lands were actual people, based on actual people, according to Jubilees. So one final thing, and I think this might be a good place to end it. Another thing is, you know how I mentioned how the scribes would change things to make it agree with the numbers, the genealogy numbers, to make it agree. Well, there are church fathers or Christian writers, such as a man by the name of George Syncellos, or Synkellos. He wrote in Greek a history of the world, and he used the scriptures as one of his primary sources. He also used Jubilees. He believed that Jubilees had historical information in it that could be trusted in certain aspects, but that Jubilees was corrupted, and that some of what Jubilees said could not be fully trusted. So he starts off copying what Jubilees says for the dates, and then something interesting happens. Then George Synkellos starts adding hundreds of years, just like we see in the Septuagint, with 100 years added in places to make it longer, make the history longer. George Synkellis is taking the information from Jubilees and he's adding 100 years onto it all throughout his chronology, because he's trying to make it closer to the Septuagint. So he actually takes the numbers of Jubilees and alters it to try to force it to fit what the Septuagint, closer to what the Septuagint says. So that's an example where you see the original text of Jubilees, and now you have a scribe with an agenda who's taking Jubilees information and altering, twisting it to make it he thinks history was. And that's what I believe happened with Genesis. The same thing happened. Just like they were altering what the information of Jubilees was in that chronology of Synkellis, the scribes are doing the same thing with the book of Genesis, altering it to force it to fit their particular view of what history was. So that's a lot of evidence to support that there was something really tricky going on with Genesis, and that the scribes, there has to be some type of, I don't like to use the word conspiracy, but it's, in a sense, it's appropriate in the text of Genesis, where there was an intentional alteration of Genesis to make it agree with a particular perspective of what they thought the truth was. They actually altered what the text said because they didn't like or agree with what it said. And there's certain justification for that. If the text is clearly in error, a scribe's job is to try to fix it. Unfortunately, scribes too often are wrong in what they think the error is, and it's actually not an error, but they alter it to make it say something even more in error. So Jubilees is key to reconstructing what the Torah originally actually said, and it's very important for textual criticism for the Torah purposes. We've talked about in the Yahad, like the whole thing with the documentary hypothesis and textual criticism for the Torah, and I think using Jubilees is important for reconstructing what the original Torah said, what Genesis through Deuteronomy said, and Dead Sea Scrolls as well. So using Dead Sea Scrolls and Jubilees, Samaritan and Septuagint, they're all key sources to try to reconstruct. That's one of the big importance of Jubilees, is all that information that gives us on filling in holes of Genesis. Because Genesis, as I said, it just tells us randomly. It says, the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. Like, why is it telling us Haran's daughters? Who cares? What's the point of mentioning their daughters, of Haran's daughters? Well, the reason it's telling us those information is because, just like as I said before in other teachings, like Genesis chapter 6, it gives us very, very small information. The reason it gives us so tiny information is because it expects you already know the story and know the information from another source. Like, Enoch walked with God and he was not. Why does it say that little snippet? Because the author of Genesis understood, yeah, you have the book of Enoch, you know the whole story, I don't need to repeat the whole thing for you. I'm just going to tell you Enoch walked with God and he was not. Because you know the rest of the story. Same thing with the sons of God coming to the daughters of man. You know that story. I'm just going to give you a very bare bones account of it. So we have the same thing in Genesis for some of the genealogy stuff. It's giving you a little bit of detail, but it's not giving you the full story. It's saying, yeah, you know some of this stuff. And when you take Jubilees combined with Genesis and you combine it, you see this amazing story of the family of Abraham, naming their family members after their ancestors. So I think it's really insightful. Anyone want to say anything or have any comments or questions?
Very thought-provoking.
Thanks, I appreciate it. What's your guys' take on Jubilees? But was someone just going to say something?
It's always amazing to me that they just overlooked this completely, the Jews did, for canonical information. I mean, it's like it's a lost book, yet it was prevalent in the time it was written and up 300 years later. Just I'm amazed that This wasn't even considered for the canon. And
Yeah,
Enoch was, I guess, because it's a different strain of religion than the people that were canonizing.
I think the problem what you have is that you have, what you had was, like, according to Second Esdras, you had like the secret books and the public books, and so it appears that, you know, the people who didn't have access to some of these books, they didn't have that information to go on, so they were free to alter, they were free to speculate because they didn't have those other sources. So that could explain why it wasn't considered for canon, because you know how the Protestants do it. They're very much tradition. They're like, the books we received are the books we received. It's probably something similar with the Jews. The Jews received from, like the Pharisees, they received from their forefathers these books. So these are the books. They received these books, like from their fathers, and those fathers received those books. So you had the Essenes, or the people, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the priest, or whoever were preserving the entire literature. And then you had the Pharisees, who were only preserving a small portion of the literature. The Pharisees were just accepting what was handed down to them. And same thing with the Christians. They were just accepting, these are the books that were given to us, these are canon. Everything else we don't trust because we don't know where they came from. That's probably what happened. That would be my theory.
So, in your opinion, who is the author of Jubilees? What individual or what group?
I come from the radical perspective that Jubilees was actually authored by Moses, or it purports to be from the angel, but it looks like it's suggesting that Moses actually wrote down what the angel was dictating to him, and that does line up with what, like, for example, Paul and Acts suggest that the law actually came from the angels. That lines up in that sense. But I'm in no way suggesting that the Dead Sea Scroll copies of Jubilees or the Ethiopian copy of Jubilees is a perfect preservation of the original. It's very... If Jubilees was actually... the original was actually written by Moses, that's like what? 1,500 years or 1,400 years, however many years before the Dead Sea Scrolls. So in that time period, a lot can be corrupted and altered. So I'm not suggesting that the Book of Jubilees that we have is everything in Jubilees is what Moses wrote, but I'm suggesting that there's like a core nucleus that Jubilees is based on, a previous source that was probably very similar to Jubilees. I've also mentioned there's evidence that Book of Jubilees was based on an earlier Book of Jubilees that was written according to Abraham. So Jubilees does appear to be like a compilation of different sources. Like it suggests it derives from Book of Enoch, Genesis Apocryphon, Testaments of the Patriarchs. So it's like a conglomeration of the different accounts. So to determine when Jubilees was written, you kind of have to base it on when were these other books written. Book of Enoch, when was that? If the Book of Enoch has a late date, then Jubilees must have a late date as well, because Jubilees is clearly secondary to Enoch. That's overwhelming evidence for that. But if the core nucleus of Enoch stems back to the man Enoch, and Enoch actually wrote it, it's possible that Jubilees also stems back to a core nucleus by Moses. But then, of course, over time, accretions are added by scribes, sometimes even whole chapters that should not be there.
What in the Book of Jubilees makes you think that it is partially linked to the 12 patriarchs?
So there's actually there's some writings called the Testaments of the 12
Right, that's what I'm asking.
And there's some similarities which are too coincidental. Like they're too lining up to be coincidence. They have to be based on either, one has to be based on the other, or they both have to be based on a common source. And there is evidence, like for the Testament of Levi, there's a document in the Dead Sea Scrolls called Aramaic Levi. And that's an older version of the Testament of Levi. And that older version has striking agreements with Jubilees, the account for Levi and Jubilees. So There's also another thing is the account of Moses' dad named Amram. There's an account of Amram, like a book of Amram, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in fragments. But the story of Amram in those fragments strikingly lines up with the story of Amram in the book of Jubilees. So it appears like Jubilees is having tons of allusions and references to all these other books. That's what it makes most sense to me. If Jubilees is compiling all these information from, like it says it got information from Enoch, Book of Noah, Book of Abraham, it would make sense that it's also getting information from these other books too. That's why I think that.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. Jackson, you said Beyond the Essene Hypothesis is the book that gets into this. What does it get into?
It gets into where the books come from. Of course, it's speculation, but the author of this book, Boccaccini, he's the head of the International Scrolls thing right now, and he takes the literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he's able to analyze it and come up with different strains, we might say different denominations of literature that predated the Qumran people. And this book is it's a wonderful book for anybody that would read it. It's very short, easy to read, but it really puts a lot of these pseudographical works into the perspective of a greater movement. So we have that in our library if anybody's interested in it. I can send you an e-copy.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that.
That's
Any
all.
other stuff relevant, like any other PDFs? Or do you think that's the main one?
Gobs of them, yeah. In our library, which we're trying to put out now, we have, well, I've been cherry picking off academia.edu and scribe.com for quite some time on documents like this, and there are some really good ones there. We're just in the process of coding them and putting them in categories. So, you know, if anybody's doing research on Essenes or something like that and they want to get into Scribed or Academia, there are some great papers that aren't necessarily published there. A lot of PhD dissertations and so forth on these subjects. And if you want to look something up, just let me know and I'll give you my login information on it.
It looks like everyone commented that they're interested.
Okay.
Or not everybody, but
I want to ask you if you would be so kind as to send me an email.
The people who are interested?
People who are interested, send me an email so I can have your information and all. And my email address, you can send it to veroyahad at gmail.com. I've got that in the chat then, and I'll get that over to you.
All right.
This is the best book that I've ever seen on this particular subject and the easiest to read. It's like Michael Clark actually has that book as his profile picture.
The Beyond the Essene Hypothesis one?
Yeah, because he's, you know, it's such an impressive book, and you learn so much in regards to the different sects, proto-sects that came before, and the tide, we might say, of these different books, which ones go together, which ones are not specifically Qumran material, and just so much more.
And I'm sorry that this series is taking so long, but there's just so much. There's so much depth to go in the Book of Jubilees. That's why it's taking so long. But
well, that's okay.
I guess it'll give you lots of stuff for your show. You're still uploading the shows to your.
Oh yeah.
Very good. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Anything else?
Brother.
Anything final? Anyone wants to say? Doesn't look like it. If anyone else wants to comment on stuff, they can. If like they had a question about something I said or something, they can always message me on Facebook or something.